Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library. Really happy to be here with you tonight to talk about grassroots organizing. What is it? How is it done? What's going on with the left, right, and center with Professor Eitan Hersh? Before we get to Eitan, though, I just wanted to say thank you to the Cary Library Foundation, which funds all of our adult programs. We couldn't do it without them and the donors that support the foundation. So again, we are recording. I want to let you know if you need subtitles, you can click on the button down at the bottom that says live transcript and click on the little arrow, and you can either have subtitles or you can have a live transcript going for anybody who needs that. It's kind of cool, I think. So we're going to get started right off with Professor Eitan Hersh. He's an associate professor of political science at Tufts University. He focuses on writing and teaching about American politics. He studies civic participation, voting rights, and the relationship between election rules, strategies, and the behavior of voters. So welcome, Eitan. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you. And it's nice to be back here virtually. I don't know, were folks on the Zoom here, were you here for the time I gave a talk in July or no? Raise your hand if you were. No, all right, some of you are invisible. Should I assume that you haven't then? Should I go, yes. Okay, I'll assume that you haven't. So if you were here for the previous talk, I'm going to be a little bit repeating of myself. It's nice to be with all of you. I'm zooming in from my apartment in Brookline here, where my 3 children are not yet sleeping, but they will be soon. And yeah, as Mina said, I'm a professor at Tufts. My research is focused on, I spent a lot of time, especially in the last year, on voting rights issues. I'm regularly in court cases related to some of the voting rights issues that we have around the country. I work a lot on campaigns, politics as a topic of study, and then I do a lot of work on civic engagement. So today I'm going to talk to you mostly about research from this last book I wrote called Politics is for Power. And it's about civic engagement. And so I want to maybe go fairly quick on the summary so we can get into conversation. The book was written because I felt there was a big problem. And the problem that I was trying to identify was the fact that everyone I knew who was doing politics wasn't actually doing politics. That is, all these people I knew, including myself, were spending an hour or 2 hours a day consuming news, worrying about politics, but none of that amounted to doing politics. If you were in my class, I would say doing politics is working with other people with a goal or a strategy to try to influence the government. You know, maybe getting other people to vote, talking to lawmakers and asking them to change their position on something. That's politics. What most people are doing, I label political hobbyism. Political hobbyism, doing politics the way obsessive sports fans follow the game, but not just the game, they follow the statistics, they follow the gossip. That's how most of us are actually doing politics. And this is a growing phenomenon. More people than ever are cognitively and emotionally engaged in politics, but it's not true that more people than ever are volunteering in politics or thinking about politics in a strategic way. The first part of the book is really a diagnosis. What does political hobbyism look like? For a lot of people, particularly well-educated Americans, it looks like obsessive news consumption that's not really targeted at learning information we need, but targeted at learning gossip, very national oriented. You can maybe find a news junkie in your life and ask them, you know, who should I vote for in Lexington elections? Who should I vote for? How do I get involved on issues of climate change, economic development? They would just blush and say, oh, I don't know anything about that. I can tell you about Trump. I can tell you about national stuff. In fact, in American politics today, we've had a shift where the more educated people get their news exclusively from national sources. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, cable TV. Less educated Americans tend to get more of their news from local newspapers and local TV broadcasts. So we're following all this news, but it's not helping us be informed as citizens, who to vote for in a local or state election, how to get involved in the community. It's more focused on gossip. If you look at activism, another thing I study, the most common form of activism in American politics is online petition signing. So if you ask people, how are you engaged in activism, here are a number of options. By far, the most popular one is signing an online petition. And if you look at what those petitions are about, like the petitions that go to the White House during the Obama years, during Trump years, anytime they're focused on quite minor things, actually. So of all of the petitions that went to the White House during the Obama years, a colleague and I studied this, and we discovered that only about 5% of the petitions were about anything like big domestic policy, taxes, education, healthcare, all that stuff. That was 5%. 95% was about kind of junk, like the FDA shouldn't regulate premium cigars, that kind of thing. Really minor issues. So people who are doing activism a lot of people who are doing activism are really just doing this kind of very shallow internet-based activism. So one goal of the book is to say this diagnosis we have, which is so many of us are engaging in politics as a hobby, whereas our cognitive engagement has increased a lot, our organized behavior has decreased over time, to the point where most people today who are spending some amount of time every day following the news don't belong to any organizations. Most people say that in the last year, they've never worked with anyone else on a civic or political venture. They've never attended a political meeting. Those are the people who say they're following the news most frequently. So we have a problem. I call that problem political hobbyism. The second goal of the book is to try to understand why we do this more now than in the past. And I won't dwell on this part. I'll just say the internet has a lot to do with it, right? We do a lot of our leisure activities in short stints throughout the day. But there's other reasons too why we do politics in sort of a shallow way. And we talk more about community organizing throughout this talk. I'll go back to this question of why aren't there stronger, more long-term, durable organizations across the country to like local political party committees or other kind of groups through which one can do civic and political engagement. Another goal of the book is to say, is this possibly a good thing that all of us are doing political hobbyism? That is, maybe if I'm obsessive about the news or spend a lot of time as an amateur pundit online conveying to my friends what my hot takes are about public life, then I'm better, aren't I, than the person who doesn't engage at all? And maybe this is a gateway into real activism. And there's a number of reasons I evaluate that we're actually making politics worse when we engage in shallow political hobbyism. But one reason is that we are really practicing the wrong skill set. So in any kind of relationship in life, when we're trying to convince someone else to do something that they wouldn't do, whether it's a boss, an employee, a student, a teacher, a parent, a child, there's a secret to success. And that secret to success is empathy, right? If you want to try to convince someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, you have to say, okay, where is that person's come from? What are their incentives? How do I move them in my direction? And indeed, in any kind of relationship, like between parents or employees or students, we know, okay, if I want to get you to do something, I got to understand where you're coming from. I got to look you in the eye. I got to move you in my direction. And in politics, that's true too. If I want to get a voter to go along with me, or I want to get a politician to change their opinion, I have to figure out where are they coming from? What are the incentives? How do I connect with them? But in political hobbyism, the way most of us are doing it, it's quite different than that. We're not really trying to convince anyone of anything. We don't approach every conversation with empathy, like we're trying to move someone in our direction. We approach politics more like we're getting something off of our chest, we're expressing something. And we feel a sense of catharsis when we express that thing. So we're doing something that looks very, very different than anyone would recommend for trying to move people in their direction. The most important part of the book, though, is the fourth goal. So the first one was defining this thing we're all doing, political hobbyism. The second goal was to say, why do we do this more now today than in the past? The third goal was to say, is this good or it's bad that we're spending all of our time on political hobbyism, so many of us? And the last goal is to talk about the alternative. That is, doing real politics. And through this book, excuse me, I followed around 7 organizers, volunteers from different walks of life who are doing politics in a totally different way. They are doing politics for power, is what I say in the book, as the title suggests. What that really means is that they are doing politics, they are moving other people in their direction, they're making things happen in their communities, and it's really exciting to watch. And I think that over the last several months, folks who have either been participating in real community organizing or watching it happen in different states get a real sense of what this looks like. Maybe I'll just tell you one of the stories in the book to convey what this looks like. Maybe I'll start with the story of Angela, who is about my age, and she moved from Wisconsin, where she's from, to a rural county in Pennsylvania that is overwhelmingly Trump-supporting Republican county. So Angela has MS, and she got really motivated to take political action on healthcare issues. She really wanted, both for herself and for other people, to have healthcare. And so she started organizing folks in, when she was in Wisconsin, she was working with her union. She's a nurse on that, but then she moved to this rural area in Pennsylvania, no Democrats in sight, and she wanted to figure out what to do. And so she and some other folks started having this amazingly successful community organization called the Voice of Westmoreland. And what do? They do everything from getting out the vote to having protests, to lobbying on policy issues, to a whole bunch of community service. And that's one part I want to emphasize. They go around, sometimes they buy gas cards for people in need. They drive their neighbors to doctor's appointments. They have diaper supplies for families who need that. And they also bring into their community organizing life a very, very generous spirit, which is not just because they're kind, but because they're strategic. So let me give you an example. I was down with this group ahead of the 2020 election. And this is a place that, very, very few Democrats are in this place, very few. And this is a progressive group, right? So they have a monthly meeting, and I attend their meeting. And I'm sitting at the table, there's about 50 people there. And at my table, there's a gentleman sitting near me who is his first time there. And he doesn't look like anyone else there. He seems very nervous, and uncomfortable. And this organizer, who's like a 23-year-old organizer, goes around the table and asks everyone why they're there. And he says, I'm an evangelical Christian, I'm pro-life, my son's in the military, Trump voter. And everyone's so like on edge, like, why is this person here? Why is he in this meeting, this one monthly meeting that this progressive group has in Westmoreland County? What is this person doing here? And then he says, I'm a Christian, and there's no such thing as a racist Christian, and that is why I'm here. That he felt that he needed to take a step away from his church community, his family, and go visit this progressive group because he was really uncomfortable with the political direction that his community has gone down. Now, what happened next? This community of liberals didn't say, Trump voter, pro-life, evangelical, get out of here. They welcomed him. They said, wow, we need you here. And you might disagree with us on a lot of issues, but we need you here. And Angela had coffee with him multiple times, and other people did. And soon enough, this guy is walking around with a clipboard, getting the vote out for Democrats in that community. Now, he's not just getting the vote out by talking to random strangers. He's getting the vote out in his own neighborhood, among his family and his church friends, people who have never voted Democrat in their life. Which brings me to just want to say something about canvassing and community organizing and all this. There's a view on the political left that, the left has really kind of championed a lot of this grassroots organizing, getting out the vote, door-to-door canvassing, phone banking. A lot of people this cycle all over the country did postcard writing. And there is science to suggest that stuff works. But here's the but. All of that stuff is a Band-Aid. It's triage. It's doing something because you don't have a deeper community connection, right? So think about someone who knows 100 people from their church or knows 100 people from their own community life. I'm one of those people, by the way. Before a local election here in Brookline, I usually send an email to 100 of my friends in town and say, here's my slate of people I'm voting for. Let me know if you have any questions. And people write back to me, say, oh, I just took your list into the polling booth. I just voted exactly how you voted, how you wanted me to vote. And why do they do that? Is because they're tricked by me? I'm duping them? No, it's because we're friends, right? Most of these people I know from a religious community. And they defer to me because I follow politics better than they do, or not better, but more. And I defer to them on all sorts of other things. And because we have a tight network of community members here, that's in a very effective way of getting out the vote, right? Think about how much more impactful that is than talking to strangers, right? All across the country, particularly in churches, people have those relationships, right? It's not knocking on doors of strangers. It's not phone banking strangers. It's not sending letters to strangers. Anytime in politics you're interacting with strangers, it's a Band-Aid for the fact that there are not personal relationships there. So what the left has done very good at is managing politics in a domain where there is not a lot of tight networks. And meanwhile, as the religious changes have happened over time, that is, as the left, particularly the white left, has gotten less engaged, overwhelmingly less engaged in church participation, and the right has not changed as much, you have this difference where you have, particularly on the right, you have tight networks, and on the left, you have energy and enthusiasm, but not as tight networks. And it's not just religion that is the cause of this. One other big factor here, it has to do with young people, because today's young people are overwhelmingly Democratic. My students, I teach a class, about 50 or 100 students in an elections class at Tufts, 90% of them will be Democrats, right? And so we have this generation that's overwhelmingly Democratic, but it's also a generation that is overwhelmingly nomadic, right? That is, the young people are deferring marriage and children until much later. They are moving a lot, like every 18 months, they're moving. And because there's a housing crisis almost everywhere in the country, they can't afford to buy homes or settle down. So they're quite nomadic, which makes it very hard to participate in a deep way. They're also, of course, not attending any kind of weekly community meeting, like even during non-COVID times, like a church. It's a group that's not attached to any kind of community organization like that. So the left and the right look different on this domain. Relatedly, there has been, I think, a shift in the provision of social services. So, churches are not just networks of religion, but they're also networks of community action and community development. Political parties, local political party organizations can also do that. Civic clubs can also do that. But over time, there's been this developed, I think, a view, particularly on the left, that political parties and politics is something different from community service. That is, unlike Angela's group, right? Angela's group that's handing out assistance to people. And actually, in many of the communities that I follow, you see this. I mean, one of the people I follow is this woman, Kiris Matias, in Haverhill, Massachusetts. She runs this thing called the Latino Coalition there. And it's a community that's focused on immigration issues, but not just in issues that are facing immigrants. But it's not just about national politics, right? It's not just about dreamers. It is about that, but it's not just about that. It's also about, like, is there someone in our kids' elementary school who can speak to the parents in Spanish? Is there someone, is the city doing a good job hiring Latino workers, right? Very concrete stuff. But in a lot of politics, the way that political hobbyists engage, it's much more detached from community life. It's about ideas. It's about the Green New Deal. It's about healthcare for all. It's not about how can I build connections to other people in my community, build those bridges in order to have a larger impact. In the first pages of this book that I wrote, I gave an example that I meant that in order to make this very point. And the example is a little scary, especially in light of what's happened in the last few weeks here. The example comes from the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina in 2018, so 2 years ago. And the example is that in 2018 in North Carolina, the Ku Klux Klan went around and handed out flyers and talked to people about opioid addiction. And they said, do you have an opioid addiction? It's not your fault. We here at the White Knights of the KKK are here to help you through it. And I use this example at the beginning of my book because I want people to say, holy moly, that's what the KKK is doing. It's not just the rallies and riots and chants. They're going around and getting new recruits by looking people in the eye and saying, do you have an addiction? It's not your fault. We're here to help you. And if they're doing that, who's on the other side of that one? Who are groups that are not the KKK, are mainstream political organizations on the left and the right? Are they doing anything close to that? Are they speaking to people's needs, or are they just talking about political gossip or national policy issues? Real political organizers on the left, right, and center, the people that whose stories I tell in the book. The book has, by the way, follows 7 people ages 19 to 98. And all of them are doing, they're all center, left of center. They're not the KKK, but they are following a model of building political support by serving a community. You serve a community by building political support. You count votes and voices in your community. You know who your people are. You know what they need. You know how to help them. And you build more and more support by service. So maybe I'll stop talking now. I've covered a lot, but in all kind of maybe only small ways. And I'm happy to open up for questions or discussion about political hobbyism, about community organizing, about lessons learned from these groups, or anything else you want to talk about. And we can do this informally. I mean, it's just a few of us here. So if you just want to unmute and ask a question, that's okay.
So Eitan, I had put in the, oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, this is Mina. I put in the chat that when you were talking about young people, I've been hearing from a lot of young people that they don't trust government and politics and politicians. So does that keep them from being more engaged or less engaged?
Yeah, I don't have the stats on me about the trust in government. Generally, people who are less trusting of government or trusting of politics, are like less likely to vote and things like that. So I would say anecdotally, my sense is that the biggest limitation for young people is not a lack of interest, or not that they don't care or anything like that, but it's that, again, they don't know how to plug in. That's what I get from my students. They're not sure how they can plug in. They're not going to be anywhere for long enough to plug into local politics. They say, on surveys, they say the most important way to participate is local politics, state politics, that kind of stuff. But they're least likely to do that because they don't know exactly where they live. Go ask a 22-year-old, where do you live? I don't know, kind of here, kind of there. Maybe next week I'll live somewhere else. So it's very hard at that stage of life to get involved. And what's happening is that if you're not getting, kind of married and settling down until you're 30, 35, there's a really long period of time where you're disengaged from community life. Yes, Sally Kesselman.
Your example of the woman who moved to, I don't remember where she moved, Westmoreland in Pennsylvania, and established a really good group that, I don't know if they did outreach, but people came to them. And that was my question about the man from the other side. he came to them. How it's, I mean, I've tried to have a lot of conversations with, like, just for instance, Trumpers, and it's very hard to find somebody who will have, I just want to listen. Like, I don't want to argue. I don't want to fight. It's very hard to find rational ones. And for me, it was. I'm not saying that's across the board, but for me, it was hard to find people who were rational enough to not just give me a party line, blanket answers, or blanket reasons. And so how, what's the other side of that? How does a group like that approach the other side?
Yeah, well, this is very interesting because one thing that's special about that group is that they're really in their opponent's territory.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I got that.
And so one thing is that they were very purposeful. They're not called Resistance Pennsylvania. They're they're called Voice of Westmoreland. So every decision about that kind of stuff was very purposeful. And then their attitude is just like, they oppose Trump, and they support Democrats, but they have a very wide range of people who support them. And so they, I would say they have a very welcoming, open attitude. Angela, after, a few months ago, was telling me she was going to a door, just to give you a sense of like who she is. Okay, she was knocking on a door of a stranger's, and the person came to the door and said, they saw Angela with her pin and her clipboard, and they said, "I hate paying taxes." And I know if I was in position of Angela at that moment, I say, "Oh God, let me get out of here. I don't want to get into a fight with someone." But Angela said, "I hate paying taxes too." She threw it right back at him, just in the same kind of angry, he said, "I hate paying taxes. I hate paying taxes too." And then she said, "Isn't it terrible? We pay these taxes. Companies don't pay, Amazon doesn't pay a dime. The roads here are terrible. Our schools are suffering. And yeah, I hate paying taxes too." Okay, a week later, that guy's knocking on doors with Angela. But the thing is, I don't want to say it's like, there's just a gift that she's able to do this. I think people can learn it. But I would say that's one of the strategies. So non-judgmental, the way you frame the organization, but there's something much deeper than that as well. So let me just give you another little story. The story is actually about me and my own children, okay? So my boys in the summer, before COVID, of course, they like going to, various fairs, like, the New Hampshire town fairs, or there's some in Massachusetts, a few of these in the summer and fall. You know what I'm talking about. They have rides and booths. And so we were walking through the booths. If you go to any fair, anywhere in the country, there's usually a Democratic booth and a Republican booth. Like the local town committee or county committee will have a Republican booth and Democrat booth. And if you look at those booths, what you'll find is almost always just like someone handing out bumper stickers or having a sign-up sheet. So me and my children walked past these booths. We noticed the Democrat and Republican one, and then we noticed one for a church, a local church in New Hampshire. And it was, you know what they were doing there? They had a kids gack making booth activity. If you don't know what gack is, it's like sort of like Play-Doh. And so they had like these ingredients, I don't know, like it was like cornstarch and food coloring and flat, whatever it was. And all it was like for free, everything at this fair costs whatever, however much money. But here you could sit at this quiet table and the kids could do this wholesome activity. And so my kids really wanted to do it. So we sat down and they did it. And then I started talking to the two people who were running the booth, who were volunteers from the church. Okay, so within like 10 seconds, it was obvious to them that A, I'm not from New Hampshire, and B, I'm Jewish. Okay, so I was not a good recruit for their church. But I run our children's programming here at my synagogue. We talked about that, and we had a nice conversation, and my kids had a nice time. And then I thought, wow, if I was new to this community, or if I was looking for a community, this was an amazing recruitment device. They provided this family activity with these nice people. Wow, and these are great people. Maybe they were social workers. I don't know who they were, but they were really good at doing this. And then I thought, how pathetic that I've never seen a Democratic group or Republican group do anything like that. That the political groups think that the recruitment is going to happen with clipboards and bumper stickers. That is not how you recruit someone who's new. You know, that's someone, only person who would go up to sign up and get a bumper sticker is someone who's already very committed.
Yep.
So I think that different, and by the way, I recognize some of you might be sitting here saying, well, I feel very uncomfortable with churches or political groups recruiting people through that kind of service, but that is the secret to success. And again, it's something that Angela could do in Westmoreland County, Massachusetts people could do. It could happen anywhere, but it has that same theme of like, you reach out to new people by being non-judgmental, welcoming, providing a community service, all that. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer to your question.
Pat has a question in the chat. Once the organizer of the Westmoreland group decided on a, oops, I lost it. Decided on a purpose, how did she get the word out to recruit similar-minded individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is one of the, Angela taught me, among other things, what protests are for. Because Angela, this wonderful volunteer organizer and mom in Westmoreland County, she hates and hated big protests. She said, oh, the Women's March, what a waste. All those people with their funny signs, who is that going to convince? Meanwhile, she protests every week. But her protest has a strategy. So a group of people started with about 4 of them outside the courthouse, which is sort of like the biggest building in their town, Greensburg, Pennsylvania. And they had signs that said, you know, whatever, we oppose the Muslim ban, we whatever, this or that. And those signs and those protests had a strategy of recruitment. They weren't meant to convince the Trump voters. They were meant to say, hey, are you in hiding? Are you with us, but you didn't know that there were other people like you? And through that, they started getting people little by little to sign up for them. Now, you don't need to use that protest strategy necessarily in an area like Lexington, but in that community, it was extremely effective because it was very hard to find like-minded people who would provide the core of that group. So that's how they did it, mostly with protest. And think about what that change was. A lot of people who were in that group at the start of the Trump years were kind of ineffectively, you know, they would call their senator's office and say, I'm mad at you for, you know, I'm mad at you for not supporting something that Trump did, all by themselves, all alone. And then you start this cell of people and build more and more and more, mostly through being out in the community and visible enough so people know who you are.
Thank you. Sabine asks, we have a lot of service organizations in Lexington ready to assist people in need at the drop of a hat. Are you suggesting coupling the service groups with a political purpose or creating new organizations altogether?
It's a good question. So I would say that the main thing is that the political groups have to think about what the community strategy is. And the community groups have to think about, well, how does policy help us get what we need? You know, if you think about Massachusetts state politics, it's very complicated, right? Think about something like school funding, right? So if you ask Democrats right now, what are their big issues that they care most about? Democrats, they'll say, apart from COVID, they will say the environment and they'll say racial equality. And in terms of racial equality, the big policy issues, or 2 of the big policy issues, have to do with policing and have to do with school funding and equality in the schools, right? Now, if you think about schools and support for schools with large numbers of minority students in Massachusetts, those schools are really underfunded. So suppose that you were a political group and you cared about that, right? It's very complicated, right? What are you supposed to do? Well, you're interested to know that there's a lot of people at the State House who would like to give the poorer districts more money, to change the formula that the state reimburses school districts through by giving poor districts more money. And the business groups and the lefty groups both like that. So who doesn't like it? Just work through my example with me. Who doesn't like that?
I have no idea.
I mean, there's something the Chamber of Commerce wants, would like to take money, more money, give more money to city school districts, to districts with large minority, large numbers of minority students. So who doesn't want that?
The suburban districts.
Yeah, that's right. Where you live and where I live, we have lobbyists essentially through the Mass Municipal Association that's going to the State House and say, don't do that. No, 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 don't change that formula. Don't take money away from our school districts. And our state representatives and state senators are saying, I can't vote for something that's going to take money away from my district. I can't. So we have people like, it's just an example, right? This might not be your issue, but what's interesting about someplace like Lexington or Brookline, right, is that there's a lot of people who would say, wow, it's really grossly unfair what our school district is like versus what other school districts are like. And yet, right, of course, it's our districts that are making sure that that stays the same. So now, if that's an issue you care about, is that an issue that the Democrats of Lexington care about, or the Republicans of Lexington? By the way, why is the chamber, why do business groups want something like this? They want something like this because it's actually in the economic interest of the state to have well-educated kids, right? It's really the fact that we have these cities and towns and this massive inequality across cities and towns that produces this result. So now, usually, if you went to the local Democrats or Republicans, particularly Democrats, they would say, well, look, we don't get involved in these issues. The people on the other side of this issue are also Democrats. We don't want to have any internal fights. And so nothing happens, right? So what I would say is that if you think that, if that's an issue, and we could have the same conversation about housing and transit and environmental regulations and all sorts of things, right? I think that a community organization, whether it's a civic or political group, has to decide we're going to insert ourselves on issues we care about and understand how they relate to our community and what our responsibility is. And then we're going to try to build support for that through creative outreach efforts that are not going to just sell people on policy merits, but by connecting to people who are our friends and our new friends and people in the community that need something from us. Here, I'll give you another little example if it's interest. I don't know if this is useful. Are my examples useful? Should I give you one more? So one of the issues that I work on in my volunteer time in Brookline is housing. And in Brookline, like in a lot of communities, the divides in town on issues like housing are not Democrat versus Republican. Of course, Brookline's a 90% Democratic town. They tend to be highly correlated with age. So people in their 20s and 30s who are struggling to afford to live anywhere are saying, we need to build more housing. And the people who are older are saying, I kind of like that my house is worth 10 times more than what I bought it for. And, our town has enough people in it. Thank you very much. Right. So now I'm thinking, okay, well, how do I build support? How do I build support among people who might not be with us? How do I get some of their older members of the community involved? And so I'm working on this strategy right now, actually, about talking to parents of kids who are graduating high school, people who are graduating, who are in college, and saying, one day you might have kids who might have their own kids. You might be a grandparent. And you know what Massachusetts housing looks like right now? Those kids are going to have to live an hour from you if they want to be able to afford, in order to afford any kind of home. And so, this is not just an issue of the environment. This is not just an issue of supporting people who are here. This is like in your interest. We have to solve this problem or else as people have more, as the jobs are so concentrated in cities, we're going to have a big problem here. Your own children and your grandchildren are going to have to move to Arizona because no one can afford to live in Massachusetts. So what am I doing when I'm saying that? I'm trying to build community around an issue I care about by speaking to other people's self-interest, by speaking to the issues that might concern them, and getting them on board by speaking on those. I don't go around and say, hey, I'm 30 whatever years old and I want to buy a house in Brookline and not just an apartment. Okay, I don't say that. That doesn't resonate. But maybe if I talk about their own children and what the housing market is doing to the next generation of young adults, then they would come around. So anyway, that's just another example of trying to think, okay, who are the people I need to convince of something? And by the way, of course, you might totally disagree with me on these issues, and that's fine. Just an example of how to think, how I think about some of these issues.
So I was going to ask you, do you think that that's kind of what happened in Georgia? I mean, they got slammed in both the November election and the January runoff with people from outside of the community just sending them postcards and calling people and things like that. But yet they were still able to flip. So do you think there was something going on internally that caused that change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that you had, yeah, I would say it's it was, you know, I think a lot of people who work in my field would attribute successes like that in Georgia, in Arizona, to much stronger community networks than, for example, a comparison case would be like Maine, where there was a ton of outside money, a ton of outside postcard writing and canvassing, but not the same depth of community organizing, not the same depth of church networks. I mean, don't forget in Georgia, all the things that I said about the lack of religious participation on the left is mostly among white people. It's not among African Americans who do attend church and you know, at very high rates. And so you have tighter networks there, and you have deeper community organizations. I mean, you know, to her credit, right? Stacey Abrams, unlike so many other people who were kind of superstars, you know, didn't run for president, didn't run for anything. She just dug in on working on these issues in her home state. And, you know, I think that's the model.
Mm-hmm. I saw that Effie had unmuted. Sally, we'll get to you next.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to your initial strategy about recruiting and ask you if you would take it one step further. And that is, you talked about appealing to people's personal interests at a level that might get them interest. And I think that definitely works. And that's that initial excitement that all of us get when somebody has struck a nerve that concerns you. The question is how to keep that going. I frequently find that you sometimes get involved in it, you try to reach out, and then there's no one to attach to move it, help you move it forward, or you put out questions. And I can give you a couple of personal examples of having followed the Massachusetts end-of-life options bill, gotten involved early, have gotten to the State House, have gotten to some promotions, have tried to reach out to the Massachusetts head people and say, my town has already put a resolution in, we support it. Who can I reach out to and my friends to reach their congressional people to support this bill? And I get nothing. So, and all I get is, will you give us more money? And it's at the point where I'm frustrated by it.
What was the issue you working on?
The end of life options bill. It's the end of life options bill. That's
Got it. Yeah. So look, I mean, it's a hard question. You know,
it is a hard question.
I think that of course, there, you know, one thing is like finding the common ground across communities, right? So having either individual people who are bridges or organizations that are bridges, right? Because you're right, you know, sometimes you're working on some issue and it's the holdup is not your own district or your own community, it's someone else's community. And so how can you support them? I mean, you know, that's certainly happening. Obviously, there's a lot of, like, the group that I'm on the board of here in Brookline on housing has peer organizations all around cities like ours. I actually don't know if there's a Lexington one, but certainly we've been in touch with the Cambridge one and the Newton one. And, these groups try to learn from one another and try to go in together. And so, to try to create that network around an issue. Obviously, the political party groups are sort of the mystery here, because they're supposed to do this, right? On one of the things I decided I wasn't going to get into it, but I'll get into it a little bit. One of the things that's really changed dramatically over the last, say, 60, 70 years is that but particularly actually in the last 20 years, is that local political parties have died. Or they're not quite dead, but in most places they are just a shell. Like they don't do very much. They have no ambitions to do anything at the state and local level. Their ambitions are really to try to get volunteers around national stuff. Sometimes they'll work on a statewide, like a governor's race or something like that, but they don't work on issues in their community. They don't work on issues that might divide Democrats or divide Republicans. Oftentimes in many communities, the Democratic and Republican committee are nothing except 5 people who attend a convention. That's it. Now there's a lot of reason that happened over time, but obviously a network of local political parties is sort of like the bridge it could be the bridge between communities on a number of issues. It's just at this point in history, for a number of reasons, those parties are not functioning that way. So community groups have to sort of reinvent the wheel all the time, issue by issue and town by town. Yes.
I was going to say about Georgia that another thing that was really different there, or incredibly responsible for a lot of the success, was that the organizing and knowing what to do came from within the state. They organized themselves, and they kind of, and also it wasn't just Georgia, but it was, it was also like Reclaim Our Vote kinds of groups, but they coordinated when all these volunteers from elsewhere wanted to do things. They were in charge. They knew what needed doing. So it wasn't like, oh, we're going to come and tell you how to do this, or we're going to come help. No, we'll help if you need us, and you'll tell us what you need done. So that the real organizing came from within. And that was what didn't happen in Maine, I think. Maine got outside money, but they didn't have the organization. And the other thing I wanted to say to is it Effie? Is just according, right in line with what Eitan is saying, is you need to go to some of these towns where you might not know somebody, but you could go to something like the League of Women Voters or something like that, and either ask if they know anyone who might be interested, or ask to give a presentation. Ask to present what this is about in a town where there may be like-minded people, but you don't know how to reach them, and actually present something, and maybe even have like a handout ready, a little brochure or whatever your organization may have, so that, you need to have entree to the community. What's her name didn't, but she moved in and she lived there. Your
Angela, right?
Yeah. So, that's just something I would suggest.
Any other reflections as we approach the hour here? Criticisms? We haven't got, no one's really been too critical here. What's the problem here? Kind of liked everything we've talked about.
Well, I thought maybe you were going to talk about what the right does that's so different. Because I've always found that, my own analysis is we're just too democratic, and everybody has to say what they have to say, and it all has to be decided by committee, and then you get these outliers who have their own issues, and they're not really related to what's really they take people off on tangents, whereas I always think of the right as being such a patriarch that they'll say, you do this, you do this, you don't want to do that. Okay, I have 12 other people who'll do it. Like, I'll forget you. And they're much more efficient in the way they really know how to get things done.
Well, I would say, let me point to two things that I think are different on the right than on the left. Apart from the one I already mentioned about the religious difference, which I think is a quite serious difference. Two others. One is the focus on state and local policy. And by the way, before I say good things that the right are doing, let me just make sure I say this thing, which is that the right's going through a period of turmoil right now, and a lot of internal division and all that. But here's what I think has been in the long term to the benefit of the right, that they've gotten right about community work. One is a much greater focus on state politics than the left has. There's an organization on the right that is not particularly well funded. I mean, it has like $100 million a year budget. So it's not tiny organization. It's a big organization, but it's not, Democrats have that kind of money too, okay? And what they do is they provide policy ideas to state legislators. Okay, so they do model legislation and say, okay, here's a bill, and you should pass this bill. It's good for gun rights, or it's good for this, it's good for that, it's good for the business community, or whatever. And don't forget, a lot of legislators, both in our state here and across the country, they don't have, half of them aren't, they basically get paid nothing. They have no staff. They're not professionals, right? So it's very hard for them to write legislation on their own. So here comes this organization. It's called ALEC, by the way, ALEC, ALEC. And they provide this service to state legislators on the right. Now, there's no real competition. There's no left-wing version of ALEC, which is strange. Why is that? Again, is it because the left can't raise $100 million? Clearly, that's not the answer. The left can send almost $100 million or whatever to like a Kentucky Senate race. They have no chance of winning. So why? The answer is, according to the professor at Columbia, Alex Hertel-Fernandez, who wrote a book about it, the answer is that the donors and the activists to the left basically think state houses are beneath them, that it's parochial, it's boring, and that the real action is happening in Washington, the Supreme Court. So they don't raise money for supporting state legislative races and issues. Even here in Massachusetts, state level politics is very, very disorganized in terms of advocacy on some of the big issues. And Massachusetts is not a leading state on a lot of issues that are important to the left. So it's curious, right? Massachusetts is sending to Washington firebrand senators who have big ideas that are very unpopular. They're never going to get them passed. But Massachusetts also has a governor who has 90% approval rating among Democrats, who doesn't support those big ideas. So that brings us to the third issue. So the second issue, so the first was the religious difference. The second was a kind of a disdain almost for state level politics on the left, and which the right does not have. By the way, sometimes I've asked in groups like, can you imagine helping a 25-year-old right out of law school run for judge? Most of the country, you have to run for judge. And a lot of people on the left say like, no, are you kidding? Like 25-year-old run for county judge? Like that seems really petty, parochial, it's beneath me. And the right says, yeah, of course, in 30 years, that person might be on the Supreme Court. I can get in on the ground floor here. So that is a really significant difference. The last thing I'll say is that on a lot of these issues, the left has some cognitive dissonance where the right does not have. That is, the left doesn't get that involved, for example, on local school funding to support school districts that are minority school districts, because even though people on the political left will say, I really care about racial equality, when it comes to local politics and local funding, they don't really mean it. When it comes to housing equality, making sure that people, no matter their income levels, can benefit from good school systems, no, the left is not on board with that. The left is not on board. They say they want the Green New Deal, but they don't really want to raise their gas taxes by 20 cents or whatever it is, right? So I think the right doesn't have that same level of dissonance. That is, they don't want the Green New Deal, they don't want it locally, and they don't want it nationally. They don't want, but the left has a real problem, I think, where when it comes to state and local politics, they don't have the same ideological preferences that they have when it comes to national politics. I mean, it's really hard to, it's kind of fascinating to think about, you know, the Senate race we had here, where the Green New Deal became like the main thing associated with Senator Ed Markey. And yet you have all these Democrats who, you know, are very satisfied with Charlie Baker and don't want to pay for some of the costs associated with environmental protection. So to me, you know, the popularity, it's interesting. And I don't say this as in a partisan way, but I'll just say that the popularity of Charlie Baker among very liberal Democrats in Massachusetts, that is like Democratic primary voters, is about the best Republican advertisement I could ever imagine making. It's like, here are these Democrats. They say they want a Green New Deal, but look when it comes to their pocketbook, who they want. They're liars, or they're just joking, or they're delusional or something, but they certainly don't want the Green New Deal and Medicare for all, not in their own state. They certainly don't want racial equality, not with a state that has increased its segregation of schools in the last 10 years. They don't want any of that stuff, right? So that is the kind of dissonance that I think associated with the left organizing that's not associated with the right.
Thank you. Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Mary asks, what are your thoughts about voter identification? How could that be pursued?
So you, sorry, can Mary say a little bit more about what she means?
Mary, do you want to unmute yourself and ask? In the meantime, I'll ask the next question from Lisa. Oh wait, she's unmuted.
Yes, I'm unmuted. I just wanted to know, there's thoughts, I'm hearing chatter about voter identification, and that would make both sides of the aisle more comfortable. And if indeed we were to think about going that direction, how would you start that motion?
Yeah, so voter ID, this is an issue I've worked a lot on.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would say is that, you know, there's two sides of it. There's what's the motivation side? What problem is it solving? And there's a sort of there's an attitude. Voters like it. A lot of voters do like it, and it makes people feel like the system is more secure. But on the other hand, there's not much evidence that there's fraud or any kind of problems in a way that voter identification would solve. So I think a lot of people say, well, there's no reason to do it because it's not really solving any problem. I would say it's a lot of the questions about its success are in the details of who's affected by it. So do you provide it for, you know, states have done a range of things. You know, for example, some states like Texas, you know, they allow you to count your concealed carry handgun license, but they don't let you count a University of Texas ID. And so that seemed to have a kind of like a partisan rationale to it. There are other states that have made it very, very easy and free to get an ID if you don't have one. And so, you know, that's a different ballgame. It's all really in the details in terms of implementation about whether it would be equitable and easy. And then you have to go to the other side of the equation, which is it worth it? Is it solving a problem?
So we have one more question from Lisa. I see she's unmuted. The question is, if folks are providing support to the local community, how do you fund that?
How do you fund
providing support to the local community?
So I'm not sure exactly what the question is getting at, but I will say that one of the, I think, funny parts of the book I wrote is my conversations with the Massachusetts campaign finance regulators about political party organizations paying for social services, which is something they were mostly uncomfortable with. But there's no problem at all, according to them, with any kind of volunteer support. You know, there's groups around the country that are providing, political groups that are having babysitting clinics and auto repair clinics and doing stuff like that to try to like just be out in the community and help people. And most of them are just, that's happening through volunteers. And so not all this costs money, right? I think if there's one thing that we've learned in the last few years is that money can't buy you elections, right? Money, you can outspend your opponents 10 to 1. And if you don't have the same kind of dense community network that they have, you're going to lose. So I think Democrats in particular, I think, have learned a wrong lesson about money in politics. They thought, well, they've been told for the long time that money in politics is very important, that the right has a lot of money in politics. It's a big problem. And so if we have enough money in politics, we can win. But that's not really true, right? The Democratic line on that is wrong, in part because money can't buy those dense networks.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that I see. I did put Eitan's book, the title of his book, in the chat, so you all can check it out if you'd like to. I will send it in the recap as well. Eitan, thank you so much for this. This is really enlightening and scary, but also a bit helpful.
My pleasure. And you know, I know that when I come here, I'm probably speaking to the choir a little bit, and that's okay. But if you get the book, get it for someone else, because we need more recruits here. There's so many people I know, we all know, who when they say they care about politics, they mean like obsessively checking poll numbers, and you know, that no political change is ever going to get made by people checking poll numbers. So get the book, and if not for yourself, and for friends and neighbors and anyone who whines to you about politics.
That would be pretty much everyone I know. So I'm going shopping.
Nice seeing you all.
Yep. Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody.
Take care.